At 11:47 on a Thursday night, I pressed play on the security footage and watched my brother carry my grandmother's jewelry box out of my bedroom, while his girlfriend rifled through my financial documents. The same brother who said he needed to stay at my house for 2 weeks while his apartment was being renovated. The same brother my parents always told me to be more understanding toward because he was going through a difficult time. They thought I was being paranoid when I mentioned installing cameras. They were about to learn that paranoia and preparation are not the same thing. Before I tell you how a generous sister turned her family's betrayal into a police report they could not talk their way out of, hit that like button and tell me where you are watching from so I know there are others who understand what it feels like when the people you trust most prove they never deserved that trust in the first place. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rachel Morrison, and for 29 years I believed that family loyalty meant giving people endless chances to prove they could change. I believed that being the responsible older sister meant absorbing the chaos that my younger brother created and helping clean up the consequences without complaint or resentment. I believed that setting boundaries with family members was selfish, that protecting yourself from people who shared your blood was a failure of love rather than an act of necessary self-preservation. I was wrong about all of those things, and the cost of being wrong nearly destroyed everything I had spent a decade building. From the outside, my life probably looked exactly like what I had worked so deliberately to create. I owned a 3-bedroom house in a neighborhood where property values had been climbing steadily for 5 years. I had purchased the house 4 years earlier, right after receiving a significant promotion to senior project manager at the construction management firm where I had worked since finishing my graduate degree. The house was not extravagant, but it represented something that mattered deeply to me. It was proof that careful planning, consistent effort, and financial discipline could create stability and security, even for someone who had grown up in a household where money was always scarce and stress was always abundant. I had decorated each room with intention, choosing furniture that balanced aesthetics with durability, investing in window treatments that provided both privacy and natural light, and creating spaces that felt both comfortable and professional enough to host work colleagues or clients when necessary. The kitchen had been partially renovated the previous summer, with new countertops and appliances that I had saved for over 18 months to purchase without taking on additional debt. The backyard had a small patio area where I would sit on weekend mornings with coffee and a book, enjoying the particular kind of peace that comes from being in a space that belongs entirely to you and reflects your own choices, rather than compromises made to accommodate others. My career had followed a similar trajectory of steady, intentional progress. I had started at Morrison & Associates as a junior coordinator, responsible for scheduling, documentation, and client communication on mid-sized commercial projects. The work was detail-intensive and often thankless, the kind of position where excellence was expected and mistakes were highly visible while successes were attributed to the team rather than to individuals. I had approached the role with the same methodical focus I brought to every professional challenge. I arrived early, stayed late when projects required it, volunteered for assignments that others found tedious, and built a reputation for being someone who could be trusted to manage complexity without requiring constant supervision or handholding. After 3 years in that initial position, I was promoted to project coordinator with direct responsibility for managing timelines, budgets, and contractor relationships on renovation projects valued between $2 and $8 million. The promotion came with a salary increase that allowed me to begin saving seriously for a house down payment, and it came with visibility to senior partners who began to recognize my name and associate it with reliability and competence. I spent 4 years in that role, managing increasingly complex projects and developing expertise in navigating the particular challenges that arose when working with historic buildings that required both preservation of original character and modernization to meet current safety and accessibility codes. The promotion to senior project manager had come 2 months before I purchased my house, and it represented a significant leap in both compensation and responsibility. I was now managing multiple projects simultaneously, supervising a team of 4 coordinators, and interfacing directly with clients during the proposal and planning phases. The role required not just technical knowledge but also interpersonal skills, the ability to manage client expectations while advocating for realistic timelines and budgets, the capacity to mediate disputes between contractors and architects, and the judgment to know when problems could be solved internally and when they needed to be escalated to partners. I had worked hard to develop those skills because I understood that technical competence alone was not sufficient for advancement beyond a certain level. I read extensively about negotiation, communication, and leadership. I sought feedback from partners and clients even when that feedback was uncomfortable to hear. I studied projects that had gone poorly to understand what warning signs I should watch for in my own work. I treated my career with the same seriousness that I brought to every other aspect of my life, and that seriousness had been rewarded with opportunities, recognition, and financial security that would have seemed impossible to the younger version of myself, who had grown up sharing a bedroom with two siblings in a house where unexpected expenses routinely triggered family crises. My brother Julian was 5 years younger than me, which meant that for most of our childhood I had occupied a strange hybrid role in his life. I was not a parent and therefore lacked formal authority, but I was also not a peer because the 5-year age gap meant that we never attended the same school simultaneously and never shared the same social circles. I was responsible for him in ways that were never clearly defined, but were constantly reinforced through parental expectations and sibling dynamics. When Julian forgot his lunch, I was expected to notice and share mine. When Julian struggled with homework, I was expected to help him even if it meant sacrificing my own study time. When Julian made poor choices that resulted in consequences, I was expected to advocate for him, to explain to teachers or coaches or eventually employers that he deserved another chance, that he was going through a difficult period, that he had potential that just needed the right environment to flourish. Our parents, Michael and Patricia Morrison, had well-intentioned but ultimately damaging approaches to parenting that created the conditions for Julian's prolonged adolescence and my premature assumption of adult responsibilities. My father worked as a maintenance supervisor for a property management company, a job that provided steady income but little flexibility and frequent stress. He would come home exhausted after 10-hour days spent responding to tenant complaints and managing contractors, and he had limited patience for the normal chaos that accompanied raising 3 children. His approach to parenting was largely reactive and punitive. When problems arose, he would deliver lectures about responsibility and consequences, assign punishments that were often disproportionate to the infractions, and then withdraw back into his own exhaustion. My mother worked part-time as a medical billing clerk, a role that allowed her to be home when we returned from school, but that also meant our family income was perpetually insufficient to cover both necessities and the kind of extras that most middle-class families took for granted. She managed the household budget with a level of stress that was palpable to everyone in the family. I remember watching her sit at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, her face tight with concentration and worry, moving money between categories in an endless attempt to make the numbers work. She coped with this financial stress by developing a fierce protective instinct toward Julian, whom she perceived as more vulnerable and sensitive than his siblings. I had a younger sister as well, Nina, who was 3 years younger than me and 2 years older than Julian. Nina had responded to the family dynamics by becoming largely invisible, excelling academically, leaving for college at 18, and subsequently building a life on the opposite coast that involved minimal contact with the family beyond obligatory holiday visits and occasional phone calls. I did not blame her for this choice. She had recognized earlier than I did that our family system was not healthy, and that participating in it required sacrifices that she was not willing to make. I sometimes envied her clarity and her willingness to prioritize her own well-being over parental expectations. But I had not made the same choice. I had stayed geographically close, maintained regular contact, attended family gatherings, and continued to play the role of responsible older daughter, who could be counted on to help when problems arose. I told myself that this choice reflected loyalty and maturity, that I was strong enough to maintain boundaries while still being present for the people I cared about. What I did not yet understand was that the family system required my participation to continue functioning in its dysfunctional patterns, and that by continuing to play my assigned role, I was enabling behaviors that were harmful both to Julian and to myself. The pattern had been consistent throughout our adult lives. Julian would make a series of poor decisions, experience negative consequences, appeal to our parents for help, and our parents would turn to me to provide whatever form of assistance was required. When Julian dropped out of college after 1 semester, leaving him with student loan debt but no degree or clear career path, I helped him create a resume and connected him with contacts in industries where he might find entry-level work. When Julian was evicted from an apartment after falling several months behind on rent, I lent him money for a security deposit on a new place and co-signed the lease because his credit was too poor to qualify on his own. When Julian lost a job after repeated conflicts with supervisors, I listened to his explanations about how the workplace was toxic and the management was incompetent, and helped him practice interview skills for his next opportunity. Each time I told myself that this was what family members did for each other, that everyone needed support during difficult periods, that Julian was still young and finding his path. Each time our parents reinforced this interpretation, thanking me for being so understanding, so generous, so willing to help when others might have given up on him. They framed my assistance as a virtue, as evidence of my strong character and family values. What they did not acknowledge, and what I did not allow myself to fully recognize, was that the help I provided never actually improved Julian's situation in any lasting way. He would stabilize temporarily, express gratitude and commitment to doing better, and then within months or sometimes weeks, he would make another set of poor choices that would result in another crisis that would require another intervention. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The most recent crisis had begun 6 weeks before the night I watched the security footage that changed everything. Julian had called me on a Tuesday evening, his voice carrying the familiar combination of stress and casual certainty that I would help that I had heard dozens of times before. The call came while I was reviewing budget projections for a project that was trending toward overrun, and I almost let it go to voicemail before deciding that ignoring it would only result in multiple follow-up calls or a worried message from our mother asking if I had talked to my brother lately. "Rachel, hey, I need to ask you something and I need you to hear me out before you say no," he began, which was already a red flag because people who are about to make reasonable requests do not typically open by anticipating rejection. "My apartment building is being renovated. They are doing a complete overhaul of the plumbing system, which means they need to access all the units. The landlord is requiring everyone on my floor to relocate temporarily while they do the work. He offered to put us up in a hotel, but it is going to be like a motel situation, really basic, shared bathrooms down the hall, and Vanessa cannot deal with that kind of setup for 2 weeks." Vanessa was his girlfriend, a woman I had met exactly twice during brief and awkward family gatherings where she had seemed simultaneously bored and vaguely hostile. The little information I had about her came primarily through our mother, who had mentioned that Vanessa worked as a salon receptionist, had been dating Julian for about 8 months, and seemed to make him happy even though she could be a bit reserved around people she did not know well. My mother had said this last part with a tone that suggested I should make more effort to be welcoming, as though Vanessa's coolness toward me was something I had caused rather than a choice she had made. "So I was thinking," Julian continued when I did not immediately respond, "could we maybe stay at your place for the 2 weeks? You have that extra bedroom that you never use and we would be super low maintenance, basically you would not even know we were there. It would just be while they finish the plumbing work and then we would be out of your way. I know it is asking a lot, but you know my financial situation is still tight after that issue with the car repair last month, and I cannot really afford to pay for a hotel when the landlord is offering one for free, but the one he is offering is just not workable for Vanessa." There were so many problematic elements in this request that I barely knew where to begin addressing them. The assumption that I would say yes despite his opening acknowledgement that he expected me to say no. The characterization of my guest bedroom as a space I never used, as though the fact that I was not currently using it meant I had no valid reason to decline to let him occupy it. The framing of Vanessa's preferences as though they were legitimate constraints that I should feel obligated to accommodate. The implication that his financial situation after a car repair somehow obligated me to provide free housing rather than being a problem he needed to solve himself. The entire architecture of the request was built on assumptions about my willingness to absorb inconvenience for his benefit without any real consideration of what I might need or want. But in the moment, sitting at my kitchen table with budget spreadsheets still open on my laptop, I did not articulate any of these objections. Instead, I asked practical questions that I told myself represented due diligence but that actually functioned to delay the refusal I knew I should deliver. How long exactly would the renovation take? Had he confirmed with his landlord that 2 weeks was the actual timeline? What would happen if the renovation took longer than expected? Would I be expected to extend the housing arrangement indefinitely? Did Vanessa understand that this was my home, and that I would need to maintain my normal routines and work schedule? Julian answered each question with the kind of breezy confidence that suggested he interpreted my asking as evidence that I was moving toward agreement. 2 weeks maximum. The landlord had been very clear about the timeline. If somehow it ran over, which was extremely unlikely, they would figure something else out and I would not be inconvenienced beyond the agreed period. Vanessa totally understood that this was my space and she was actually really respectful and quiet. I would barely notice she was there. He kept emphasizing how grateful he was that I was even considering it, how much it meant to him that he had a sister he could count on when things got difficult, how he knew he could always come to me because I understood him better than anyone else in the family. That last statement should have been a warning rather than a compliment. The fact that I understood him meant that I understood his patterns, his history of boundary violations, his tendency to treat other people's generosity as obligation rather than gift. But instead of recognizing the warning, I felt the familiar pull of responsibility and the complicated satisfaction that came from being needed, from being the person others turned to when they had nowhere else to go. I told him I needed to think about it overnight and that I would call him back the next day with a decision. He agreed, but his tone suggested that he considered this a formality, that he had already mentally moved into my guest bedroom and was simply waiting for me to catch up with the inevitability of the arrangement. After we ended the call, I sat for a long time at my kitchen table, watching the sky darken outside my window, feeling the weight of a decision that I already knew I would make even though every instinct told me it was a mistake. I called my mother the next morning, telling myself that I was seeking advice but actually seeking permission to say no, or perhaps seeking someone who would tell me definitively that saying yes was the wrong choice and therefore releasing me from the guilt I would feel if I refused. The conversation did not go the way I hoped. My mother listened to my concerns, acknowledged that it was my home and therefore my decision, and then proceeded to make a case for why helping Julian was the right thing to do. "He really is trying, Rachel," she said, her voice carrying the weary hopefulness I had heard countless times before. "This job he has now, it is the longest he has held any position in 3 years. Vanessa seems to be a stabilizing influence. If he can just get through this renovation situation without it derailing everything, I think he might finally be turning a corner. I know he has made mistakes and I know you have been incredibly patient with him, but this is such a small thing in the scheme of everything you have. 2 weeks in a guest room that otherwise sits empty versus potentially throwing him into chaos that could cost him this job and this relationship. I am not saying you have to do it, but I am saying that sometimes the inconvenience we accept for family is what allows them to get to the other side of their struggles." The argument was both emotionally manipulative and logically flawed, but it was also exactly what I expected to hear and exactly what I needed to hear in order to make the decision that aligned with my ingrained role in the family system. I told her I would agree to the 2-week arrangement, and I called Julian that afternoon to let him know he could move in the following weekend. His gratitude was effusive and immediate, full of promises about how little space he would take up, and how much he appreciated having a sister who was always there for him when he needed help. The move-in happened on a Saturday morning. Julian arrived with Vanessa and what seemed like a disproportionate amount of luggage for a 2-week stay. I had prepared the guest bedroom by clearing out the closet, providing fresh linens, and making space in the bathroom for their toiletries. I had also made a list of house rules that I planned to discuss with them calmly and clearly, establishing boundaries around noise levels, kitchen usage, having additional guests, and maintaining the general cleanliness of shared spaces. But when I tried to have that conversation, sitting at my dining table while they unloaded their car, the dynamic immediately became uncomfortable in ways I had not anticipated. Julian listened with an expression that suggested he found my rules slightly absurd, given that he was family and I was acting like he was a tenant rather than a brother. Vanessa said almost nothing, scrolling through her phone with an air of detachment that made it clear she considered the entire conversation beneath her attention. When I finished explaining my expectations, Julian said, "Sure, of course, whatever you need," in a tone that managed to be both agreeable and dismissive, and then they continued moving their belongings into the guest bedroom without further discussion. The first few days were relatively uneventful, though I noticed small things that created low-level irritation. The bathroom they were using was consistently left in disarray, with wet towels on the floor and toiletries spread across the counter. The kitchen would have dishes in the sink when I came home from work, despite my having explained that I preferred to keep the kitchen clean because I used it for work-related entertaining. Julian and Vanessa would stay up late watching television at volumes that I could hear clearly from my bedroom, requiring me to either ask them to turn it down, which felt petty, or wear earplugs, which felt like an unreasonable accommodation to make in my own home. But these were minor frustrations, the kind of small conflicts that arise whenever people share space, and I told myself that they were manageable for 2 weeks. I focused on my work, spent as much time as possible in my home office with the door closed, and tried to maintain a cordial but distant relationship with Vanessa, who seemed to regard me with a combination of suspicion and resentment that I could not fully understand and did not feel equipped to address. It was during the second week that I began to notice things that troubled me more significantly than wet towels and late-night television. I came home from work one evening to find that someone had been in my bedroom, which was supposed to be off-limits according to the boundaries I had established. I knew someone had been inside because a stack of mail that I had left on my dresser had been moved, and a drawer that I always kept closed was slightly ajar. When I asked Julian about it, he looked genuinely confused and said he had not been in my room and could not imagine why Vanessa would have gone in there either, suggesting that maybe I was misremembering where I had left things. I did not push the issue because I had no proof, and because accusing someone of violating my space without evidence seemed likely to create conflict that would make the remaining days of their stay even more uncomfortable. But the incident left me feeling uneasy in my own home, hyper-aware of my surroundings in a way that I had never experienced before. I started closing my bedroom door even when I was home, something I had never done previously. I moved important documents and valuables into my car, rather than leaving them in the house. I found myself mentally cataloging the contents of drawers and shelves, so that I would notice if anything else was moved or missing. The 2-week timeline that Julian had promised turned out to be fictional, though I did not discover this until the day before they were supposed to move out. Julian informed me casually, while I was making dinner, that the renovation was taking longer than expected and that his landlord had said it would be at least another week, possibly 10 days, before the building would be ready for occupancy. He delivered this information as though it was a minor update rather than a significant violation of the terms we had agreed upon, and he seemed genuinely surprised when I told him that extending the arrangement was not acceptable, and that he would need to find alternative housing if his apartment was not ready by the originally agreed date. "Come on, Rachel, do not be like that," he said, his tone shifting from casual to wounded. "Where am I supposed to go? You have the space and it is only a few extra days. Why are you being so rigid about this? It is not like having us here is costing you anything." That statement, the suggestion that their presence was cost-free simply because they were not paying rent, crystallized something that had been building in me throughout the 2 weeks. Their presence was costing me. It was costing me peace in my own home. It was costing me the ability to maintain the routines and boundaries that allowed me to manage work stress effectively. It was costing me the sense of security that came from knowing that my private spaces were actually private. And most significantly, it was costing me the relationship with my brother that I had been trying to preserve, because every day they stayed was another day that revealed how little he actually respected me or considered my needs. But I also knew that refusing to extend the arrangement would result in a family crisis. Julian would call our parents to explain that his heartless sister was throwing him out despite his desperate circumstances. Our mother would call me to mediate, to ask why I could not be more flexible, to remind me that family was supposed to help each other. I would be positioned as the unreasonable one, the person whose rigid boundaries and lack of compassion created unnecessary hardship for someone who was already struggling. And in that moment, exhausted from work and from 2 weeks of managing uncomfortable dynamics in my own home, I did not have the energy to withstand that pressure. So I agreed to 1 additional week. Just 7 more days, I told him firmly. After that, regardless of the status of his apartment, he needed to find somewhere else to stay. Julian agreed readily, thanking me with what seemed like genuine relief, and I returned to making dinner while trying to suppress the growing sense that I had made a terrible mistake by ever agreeing to this arrangement in the first place. It was during that extended week that I made the decision to install security cameras. The decision was not based on a single dramatic incident, but rather on an accumulation of small observations that had created a persistent unease I could not ignore. I noticed that Julian and Vanessa would have long, quiet conversations that would stop abruptly whenever I entered a room. I noticed that Vanessa had begun asking questions about my work schedule, when I typically left in the morning and when I usually returned in the evening, questions that she framed as polite interest but that felt like reconnaissance. I noticed that my laptop, which I usually left on my home office desk, had been moved slightly one evening when I returned from a late meeting. I researched camera systems during my lunch breaks, reading reviews and comparing features. I was looking for something that would be easy to install without requiring professional setup, that would provide clear video quality even in low light, that would store footage securely in the cloud so that it could not be erased by someone who discovered the cameras, and that would alert me via phone notification if motion was detected in my home when I was not there. I found a system that met all of these requirements, ordered it for express delivery, and installed 3 cameras over a weekend when Julian and Vanessa had gone out to visit friends. I placed one camera in the living room, positioned to capture the main entrance and the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I placed a second camera in the kitchen, where it would record anyone accessing the back door or moving through the space. I placed the third camera in my bedroom, hidden among books on a high shelf where it would not be immediately visible, but would capture the entire room including the dresser where I kept important documents, and the closet where I stored items of significant financial and sentimental value. The cameras were small enough to be unobtrusive, and I did not mention their existence to Julian or Vanessa. I told myself that this was my home, and I had every right to install security equipment without announcing it to temporary guests, that I was not violating their privacy because they were in spaces that belonged to me. But I also felt a guilty awareness that installing hidden cameras represented a level of distrust that was incompatible with the family relationship I was supposed to be maintaining. If I truly believed Julian was trustworthy, I would not need cameras. The fact that I was installing them was an admission that I suspected him of behavior that required monitoring and documentation. The cameras went live on a Monday evening. I tested the system to ensure I could access the footage from my phone, that the motion alerts were working properly, that the video quality was sufficient to clearly identify faces and actions. Everything functioned exactly as promised. I felt a strange combination of relief and sadness. Relief that I now had a way to know definitively whether my concerns were justified or whether I was being paranoid and unfair. Sadness that my relationship with my brother had deteriorated to the point where installing surveillance equipment felt necessary. For 2 days, nothing remarkable appeared in the footage. I would check it periodically throughout the day, watching timestamp clips of Julian and Vanessa moving through the house, making meals, watching television, engaging in the mundane activities of temporary residence. The footage was simultaneously boring and reassuring. Whatever suspicions I had been harboring seemed unfounded. They were simply living in my space, perhaps inconsiderately but not maliciously. Then came Thursday. I had a full day of client meetings that kept me out of the office from 8 in the morning until nearly 7 in the evening. I had mentioned to Julian that morning that I would be gone all day, and would probably grab dinner on my way home, so they should not wait for me. He had acknowledged this information with a casual nod, and I had left thinking nothing of the conversation. My phone began sending motion alerts around 2 in the afternoon. This was not unusual because the cameras were sensitive enough to detect any movement in their field of view, and Julian and Vanessa were presumably moving around the house during their day off. But the frequency of the alerts was higher than normal, and after the 7th notification in 30 minutes, I opened the app during a break between meetings to see what was triggering such constant activity. What I saw made my heart stop and then immediately begin racing with an intensity that made me physically dizzy. The bedroom camera showed Vanessa standing in front of my dresser, going through the drawers systematically. She was not being casual or careless about it. She was being methodical, checking each drawer, removing items, examining them, and then either replacing them or setting them aside in a small pile on my bed. Julian was visible in the frame as well, standing near my closet with a cardboard box in his hands, removing items from the shelves and placing them in the box. I watched this scene for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, my mind trying to process what I was seeing, while my body remained frozen in the conference room where I had stepped away to take what I thought would be a routine check of routine camera footage. Then I closed the app, returned to the meeting I was supposed to be attending, and somehow maintained enough composure to participate in the discussion about project timelines and budget allocations even though every word felt like it was being spoken by someone else using my voice while my actual consciousness remained trapped in that moment of revelation, watching my brother steal from me in the home I had opened to him out of love and obligation. I did not go home immediately after the meetings ended. I sat in my car in the parking garage for nearly an hour, alternating between watching more camera footage and trying to decide what to do with what I had discovered. The footage showed that they had spent approximately 3 hours in my bedroom, going through every drawer, every shelf, every storage container. They had taken jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, financial documents that included bank statements and investment records, my passport, the title to my car, and several small electronics including a tablet and a camera that I had not used recently but that held significant value. The violation was so complete and so calculated that it destroyed any remaining hope I might have harbored that this was a misunderstanding, or that Julian deserved the endless chances I had given him. This was not a mistake. This was not poor judgment or a temporary lapse during a difficult period. This was theft, planned and executed by two people who had deliberately cultivated my trust in order to gain access to my home and my belongings. I could have confronted them directly. I could have driven home, walked into the house with the camera footage queued on my phone, and demanded an explanation that we all knew they could not provide. But I did not do that because I understood that a confrontation would result in denial, deflection, and manipulation. Julian would claim that I was misinterpreting what the footage showed, that he was simply organizing things or looking for something specific with innocent intentions. Our parents would be drawn into the conflict, and the entire situation would devolve into emotional arguments about trust and family, and whether I was overreacting to a situation that had a reasonable explanation. Instead, I made a different choice. I opened my phone and searched for the non-emergency number for the local police department. I called and explained that I had video evidence of theft occurring in my home, that the individuals involved were still in the house as far as I knew, and that I wanted to file a formal report. The dispatcher asked several questions to assess the situation, confirmed my address, and told me that officers would meet me at my home within the hour. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind oscillating between rage and grief. When I pulled into my driveway, Julian's car was still parked on the street. The house looked exactly as it always did, peaceful and unremarkable. There was no external sign that anything was wrong, that the trust one had extended had been weaponized against me, that the family loyalty I had practiced for 29 years was about to be permanently severed by my decision to choose truth and accountability over protection and enabling. I waited in my car for the police to arrive, because I did not want to enter the house alone and risk a confrontation before official documentation could occur. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, a man and a woman both appearing to be in their mid-30s. I met them on the sidewalk and explained the situation as concisely as I could. My brother and his girlfriend had been staying with me temporarily. I had installed security cameras. The footage showed them stealing from me this afternoon. They were likely still inside. The female officer asked if I had the footage available to show them. I pulled it up on my phone, and we stood on my front lawn in the fading evening light while they watched my brother and his girlfriend systematically rob me. When the footage ended, the male officer looked at me with an expression that combined professional neutrality with something that might have been sympathy. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked. I looked at my house, at the windows where warm light glowed behind curtains I had chosen, at the door I had walked through thousands of times believing that home was supposed to be a place of safety and rest. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone telling me that sometimes the inconvenience we accept for family is what allows them to get to the other side of their struggles. I thought about every time I had absorbed chaos, provided help, extended chances, swallowed my legitimate anger in order to keep the peace and maintain the fiction that our family functioned in healthy ways. "Yes," I said. "I want to press charges." The officers approached the house with me, following several steps behind. One of them knocked firmly on the door. After a moment, Julian answered, his expression shifting from casual greeting to confusion to dawning alarm as he registered the uniforms and the badges and the reality that whatever he had been expecting to happen this evening, this was not it. "Julian Morrison?" the female officer asked. "Yes," he said, his voice already taking on the defensive tone I had heard so many times before. "We need you and anyone else in the house to step outside, please," she said. "We have a report of theft and we need to speak with you." What followed was a scene that I will remember with perfect clarity for the rest of my life. Julian and Vanessa were asked to sit on the front steps, while the officers went inside to verify that the items shown in the footage were indeed missing from their proper locations and present in the guest bedroom where Julian and Vanessa had been staying. I stood in my front yard, watching my neighbors' curtains twitch as they tried to understand why police cars were parked in front of my house, why my brother was sitting on my front steps with his head in his hands, why the sister who was known throughout the family as endlessly patient and forgiving had finally decided that some violations could not be forgiven. The officers emerged from the house carrying evidence bags containing the items that had been taken from my bedroom. They read Julian and Vanessa their rights. They explained that they were being arrested for theft, and that additional charges might follow depending on the value of the stolen items and the district attorney's assessment of the case. They placed handcuffs on both of them with a procedural efficiency that suggested this was routine work, completely unaware that they were participating in the complete destruction of a family system that had survived 3 decades of dysfunction, but could not survive this final betrayal. Julian looked at me as they guided him toward the patrol car, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger and something that might have been betrayal, as though I were the one who had violated a sacred trust by refusing to absorb this final injury in silence. He did not apologize. He did not try to explain. He simply said, "How could you do this?" As though calling the police to report a crime was a greater transgression than committing that crime in the first place. I did not answer because there was no answer that would penetrate the worldview that had allowed him to steal from his own sister, and then feel victimized when she declined to protect him from the consequences. The patrol cars pulled away from my house carrying my brother toward a jail cell, and a criminal record and a reckoning that was decades overdue. I stood alone in my front yard as the sun finished setting, as my neighbors slowly stopped watching, as the adrenaline that had carried me through the previous hours began to fade and leave behind exhaustion and grief and a strange, terrible relief that the performance was finally over. I walked into my house, closed and locked the door behind me, and sat in my living room in the dark for a long time before I remembered that I still had camera footage to review, evidence to preserve, a police report to follow up on, parents to notify, a life to rebuild from the rubble of a loyalty that had never been mutual. The road ahead would be difficult in ways I could not yet fully comprehend. But for the first time in my adult life, I was no longer carrying the weight of other people's choices, no longer responsible for managing chaos that I had not created, no longer pretending that family love required me to set myself on fire to keep others warm. The security cameras that I had installed out of suspicion and fear had given me something more valuable than evidence. They had given me permission to finally tell the truth and to build a life based on that truth rather than on the comfortable fictions that family systems require in order to maintain their dysfunctional equilibrium. And that gift, painful as it was to receive, would prove to be the foundation for everything that came after. The arrest of my brother and his girlfriend on that Thursday evening represented a rupture in my family's narrative that could not be repaired through the usual mechanisms of deflection, minimization, and enforced forgiveness. For the first time in my adult life, I had taken an action that could not be undone, that created consequences extending beyond hurt feelings and temporary estrangement, that forced everyone involved to acknowledge a reality they had spent years actively denying. The hours and days immediately following the arrest would reveal just how deeply invested my family system was in maintaining its dysfunctional patterns, and how much resistance I would face for refusing to continue participating in those patterns. I did not call my parents that evening. I knew that Julian would contact them as soon as he was allowed to make a phone call from jail, and I needed time to prepare myself for the conversation that would inevitably follow. I spent the remainder of Thursday evening methodically documenting everything that had occurred. I downloaded all the security camera footage to multiple backup locations, ensuring that even if something happened to the cameras themselves or to the cloud storage service, I would retain evidence of what Julian and Vanessa had done. I photographed the guest bedroom where they had been staying, documenting the items they had packed and the general state of the room. I made a detailed written inventory of everything that had been taken from my bedroom, including estimated values for each item based on recent appraisals or purchase prices. This documentation process served multiple purposes beyond the practical need to support the criminal case. It gave me something concrete and methodical to focus on during hours when my mind threatened to spiral into overwhelming emotion. It created a record that would protect me against the inevitable attempts to reframe the narrative or question my memory of events. Most importantly, it reinforced my decision to pursue legal accountability, rather than family reconciliation, by forcing me to confront the full extent of the violation, rather than allowing myself to minimize it in the way I had minimized so many previous incidents. The financial value of the stolen items totaled approximately $18,000. My grandmother's jewelry alone accounted for nearly 12,000 of that total. She had passed away 7 years earlier, and in her will she had specified that certain pieces should go to her granddaughters. I had received a sapphire necklace that she had worn on her wedding day, a set of pearl earrings that had belonged to her own mother, and a diamond bracelet that my grandfather had given her on their 25th anniversary. These pieces were not just valuable in monetary terms. The cameras went live on a Monday evening. I tested the system to ensure I could access the footage from my phone, that the motion alerts were working properly, that the video quality was sufficient to clearly identify faces and actions. Everything functioned exactly as promised. I felt a strange combination of relief and sadness. Relief that I now had a way to know definitively whether my concerns were justified or whether I was being paranoid and unfair. Sadness that my relationship with my brother had deteriorated to the point where installing surveillance equipment felt necessary. For 2 days, nothing remarkable appeared in the footage. I would check it periodically throughout the day, watching timestamp clips of Julian and Vanessa moving through the house, making meals, watching television, engaging in the mundane activities of temporary residents. The footage was simultaneously boring and reassuring. Whatever suspicions I had been harboring seemed unfounded. They were simply living in my space, perhaps inconsiderately but not maliciously. Then came Thursday. I had a full day of client meetings that kept me out of the office from 8 in the morning until nearly 7 in the evening. I had mentioned to Julian that morning that I would be gone all day, and would probably grab dinner on my way home, so they should not wait for me. He had acknowledged this information with a casual nod, and I had left thinking nothing of the conversation. My phone began sending motion alerts around 2 in the afternoon. This was not unusual because the cameras were sensitive enough to detect any movement in their field of view, and Julian and Vanessa were presumably moving around the house during their day off. But the frequency of the alerts was higher than normal, and after the 7th notification in 30 minutes, I opened the app during a break between meetings to see what was triggering such constant activity. What I saw made my heart stop and then immediately begin racing with an intensity that made me physically dizzy. The bedroom camera showed Vanessa standing in front of my dresser, going through the drawers systematically. She was not being casual or careless about it. She was being methodical, checking each drawer, removing items, examining them, and then either replacing them or setting them aside in a small pile on my bed. Julian was visible in the frame as well, standing near my closet with a cardboard box in his hands, removing items from the shelves and placing them in the box. I watched this scene for 30 seconds that felt like 30 minutes, my mind trying to process what I was seeing, while my body remained frozen in the conference room where I had stepped away to take what I thought would be a routine check of routine camera footage. Then I closed the app, returned to the meeting I was supposed to be attending, and somehow maintained enough composure to participate in the discussion about project timelines and budget allocations, even though every word felt like it was being spoken by someone else using my voice while my actual consciousness remained trapped in that moment of revelation, watching my brother steal from me in the home I had opened to him out of love and obligation. I did not go home immediately after the meetings ended. I sat in my car in the parking garage for nearly an hour, alternating between watching more camera footage and trying to decide what to do with what I had discovered. The footage showed that they had spent approximately 3 hours in my bedroom, going through every drawer, every shelf, every storage container. They had taken jewelry that had belonged to my grandmother, financial documents that included bank statements and investment records, my passport, the title to my car, and several small electronics including a tablet and a camera that I had not used recently but that held significant value. The violation was so complete and so calculated that it destroyed any remaining hope I might have harbored that this was a misunderstanding, or that Julian deserved the endless chances I had given him. This was not a mistake. This was not poor judgment or a temporary lapse during a difficult period. This was theft, planned and executed by 2 people who had deliberately cultivated my trust in order to gain access to my home and my belongings. I could have confronted them directly. I could have driven home, walked into the house with the camera footage queued on my phone, and demanded an explanation that we all knew they could not provide. But I did not do that because I understood that a confrontation would result in denial, deflection, and manipulation. Julian would claim that I was misinterpreting what the footage showed, that he was simply organizing things or looking for something specific with innocent intentions. Our parents would be drawn into the conflict, and the entire situation would devolve into emotional arguments about trust and family, and whether I was overreacting to a situation that had a reasonable explanation. Instead, I made a different choice. I opened my phone and searched for the non-emergency number for the local police department. I called and explained that I had video evidence of theft occurring in my home, that the individuals involved were still in the house as far as I knew, and that I wanted to file a formal report. The dispatcher asked several questions to assess the situation, confirmed my address, and told me that officers would meet me at my home within the hour. I drove home with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, my mind oscillating between rage and grief. When I pulled into my driveway, Julian's car was still parked on the street. The house looked exactly as it always did, peaceful and unremarkable. There was no external sign that anything was wrong, that the trust one had extended had been weaponized against me, that the family loyalty I had practiced for 29 years was about to be permanently severed by my decision to choose truth and accountability over protection and enabling. I waited in my car for the police to arrive, because I did not want to enter the house alone and risk a confrontation before official documentation could occur. 2 officers arrived within 20 minutes, a man and a woman both appearing to be in their mid-30s. I met them on the sidewalk and explained the situation as concisely as I could. My brother and his girlfriend had been staying with me temporarily. I had installed security cameras. The footage showed them stealing from me this afternoon. They were likely still inside. The female officer asked if I had the footage available to show them. I pulled it up on my phone, and we stood on my front lawn in the fading evening light while they watched my brother and his girlfriend systematically rob me. When the footage ended, the male officer looked at me with an expression that combined professional neutrality with something that might have been sympathy. "Do you want to press charges?" he asked. I looked at my house, at the windows where warm light glowed behind curtains I had chosen, at the door I had walked through thousands of times believing that home was supposed to be a place of safety and rest. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone telling me that sometimes the inconvenience we accept for family is what allows them to get to the other side of their struggles. I thought about every time I had absorbed chaos, provided help, extended chances, swallowed my legitimate anger in order to keep the peace and maintain the fiction that our family functioned in healthy ways. "Yes," I said. "I want to press charges." The officers approached the house with me, following several steps behind. One of them knocked firmly on the door. After a moment, Julian answered, his expression shifting from casual greeting to confusion to dawning alarm as he registered the uniforms and the badges and the reality that whatever he had been expecting to happen this evening, this was not it. "Julian Morrison?" the female officer asked. "Yes," he said, his voice already taking on the defensive tone I had heard so many times before. "We need you and anyone else in the house to step outside, please," she said. "We have a report of theft and we need to speak with you." What followed was a scene that I will remember with perfect clarity for the rest of my life. Julian and Vanessa were asked to sit on the front steps, while the officers went inside to verify that the items shown in the footage were indeed missing from their proper locations and present in the guest bedroom where Julian and Vanessa had been staying. I stood in my front yard, watching my neighbors' curtains twitch as they tried to understand why police cars were parked in front of my house, why my brother was sitting on my front steps with his head in his hands, why the sister who was known throughout the family as endlessly patient and forgiving had finally decided that some violations could not be forgiven. The officers emerged from the house carrying evidence bags containing the items that had been taken from my bedroom. They read Julian and Vanessa their rights. They explained that they were being arrested for theft, and that additional charges might follow depending on the value of the stolen items and the district attorney's assessment of the case. They placed handcuffs on both of them with a procedural efficiency that suggested this was routine work, completely unaware that they were participating in the complete destruction of a family system that had survived 3 decades of dysfunction, but could not survive this final betrayal. Julian looked at me as they guided him toward the patrol car, his expression a mixture of disbelief and anger and something that might have been betrayal, as though I were the one who had violated a sacred trust by refusing to absorb this final injury in silence. He did not apologize. He did not try to explain. He simply said, "How could you do this?" As though calling the police to report a crime was a greater transgression than committing that crime in the first place. I did not answer because there was no answer that would penetrate the worldview that had allowed him to steal from his own sister, and then feel victimized when she declined to protect him from the consequences. The patrol cars pulled away from my house carrying my brother toward a jail cell, and a criminal record and a reckoning that was decades overdue. I stood alone in my front yard as the sun finished setting, as my neighbors slowly stopped watching, as the adrenaline that had carried me through the previous hours began to fade and leave behind exhaustion and grief and a strange, terrible relief that the performance was finally over. I walked into my house, closed and locked the door behind me, and sat in my living room in the dark for a long time before I remembered that I still had camera footage to review, evidence to preserve, a police report to follow up on, parents to notify, a life to rebuild from the rubble of a loyalty that had never been mutual. The road ahead would be difficult in ways I could not yet fully comprehend. But for the first time in my adult life, I was no longer carrying the weight of other people's choices, no longer responsible for managing chaos that I had not created, no longer pretending that family love required me to set myself on fire to keep others warm. The security cameras that I had installed out of suspicion and fear had given me something more valuable than evidence. They had given me permission to finally tell the truth and to build a life based on that truth rather than on the comfortable fictions that family systems require in order to maintain their dysfunctional equilibrium. And that gift, painful as it was to receive, would prove to be the foundation for everything that came after. The arrest of my brother and his girlfriend on that Thursday evening represented a rupture in my family's narrative that could not be repaired through the usual mechanisms of deflection, minimization, and enforced forgiveness. For the first time in my adult life, I had taken an action that could not be undone, that created consequences extending beyond hurt feelings and temporary estrangement, that forced everyone involved to acknowledge a reality they had spent years actively denying. The hours and days immediately following the arrest would reveal just how deeply invested my family system was in maintaining its dysfunctional patterns, and how much resistance I would face for refusing to continue participating in those patterns. I did not call my parents that evening. I knew that Julian would contact them as soon as he was allowed to make a phone call from jail, and I needed time to prepare myself for the conversation that would inevitably follow. I spent the remainder of Thursday evening methodically documenting everything that had occurred. I downloaded all the security camera footage to multiple backup locations, ensuring that even if something happened to the cameras themselves or to the cloud storage service, I would retain evidence of what Julian and Vanessa had done. I photographed the guest bedroom where they had been staying, documenting the items they had packed and the general state of the room. I made a detailed written inventory of everything that had been taken from my bedroom, including estimated values for each item based on recent appraisals or purchase prices. This documentation process served multiple purposes beyond the practical need to support the criminal case. It gave me something concrete and methodical to focus on during hours when my mind threatened to spiral into overwhelming emotion. It created a record that would protect me against the inevitable attempts to reframe the narrative or question my memory of events. Most importantly, it reinforced my decision to pursue legal accountability, rather than family reconciliation, by forcing me to confront the full extent of the violation, rather than allowing myself to minimize it in the way I had minimized so many previous incidents. The financial value of the stolen items totaled approximately $18,000. My grandmother's jewelry alone accounted for nearly $12,000 of that total. She had passed away 7 years earlier, and in her will she had specified that certain pieces should go to her granddaughters. I had received a sapphire necklace that she had worn on her wedding day, a set of pearl earrings that had belonged to her own mother, and a diamond bracelet that my grandfather had given her on their 25th anniversary. These pieces were not just valuable in monetary terms. They represented continuity across generations, tangible connections to family history, and to a woman who had loved me unconditionally in ways that my own parents had never quite managed. The theft of those specific items felt particularly calculated and cruel. Julian knew what they meant to me because I had shown them to him years earlier, explaining their history and their significance. He knew they were irreplaceable not because of their market value but because of what they represented. Taking them was not simply opportunistic theft. It was a deliberate choice to inflict maximum harm, to violate not just my physical space and financial security, but also my connection to family legacy and inherited love. The financial documents that had been taken were equally concerning from a different perspective. Bank statements from the previous 6 months, investment account summaries, the title to my car, my passport, and various other papers that collectively provided a comprehensive picture of my financial situation and personal identification information. The implications were deeply troubling. These were not items with immediate resale value. Their theft suggested intentions that extended beyond simple robbery to potential identity theft, financial fraud, or other forms of exploitation that could cause damage far exceeding the immediate loss. I barely slept that night. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through decades of memories that I was now reassessing through the lens of what had been revealed. How many times had Julian claimed to need help, when what he actually needed was access to resources he could exploit? How many times had I interpreted his requests as evidence of trust, when they were actually evidence of his awareness that I could be manipulated through appeals to family loyalty? How many times had I given him chances to prove he could change when what I was actually doing was teaching him that there would never be meaningful consequences for betraying my trust? The questions were painful not just because they revealed my brother's character, but because they revealed my own patterns of self-deception and enablement. I had told myself for years that I was being generous, patient, and loving. What I had actually been doing was participating in a dynamic that harmed both of us. My willingness to absorb mistreatment had prevented Julian from ever having to genuinely confront the consequences of his choices, and it had prevented me from establishing the boundaries necessary for any healthy relationship. I had been so invested in the identity of responsible older sister, who could be counted on in a crisis, that I had never stopped to ask whether the crises themselves were being manufactured specifically because I could be counted on to respond to them. My phone rang at 7:30 Friday morning. I had been awake for hours by that point, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee I had not drunk and toast I had not eaten, watching the sky gradually lighten outside my window. The caller identification showed my mother's number. I considered not answering, but I knew that avoidance would only delay the inevitable conversation and make it more difficult when it finally occurred. I took a deep breath and accepted the call. My mother's voice was tight with a combination of distress and carefully controlled anger. She began by asking if I knew what had happened to Julian, a question that was technically reasonable but that felt accusatory in its phrasing, as though his arrest were something that had happened to him rather than something he had caused through his own actions. I confirmed that yes, I was aware of his arrest because I was the person who had reported the theft to police. There was a long silence after this confirmation, and I could hear my mother's breathing change in a way that indicated she was trying to control her emotional response before speaking. When she did speak, her words came in a rush that suggested she had been rehearsing them during the drive over to my father's workplace or during whatever other urgent consultation had occurred between them after receiving Julian's call from jail. She told me that Julian had explained the situation to them, that there had been a terrible misunderstanding, that he had not been stealing from me but had been packing items that he thought I wanted to donate or store because I had mentioned wanting to declutter. She told me that Vanessa had been helping him organize, and that I had completely misinterpreted innocent behavior as theft. She told me that my decision to call the police without talking to Julian first was a catastrophic overreaction that had turned a family matter into a legal nightmare that could ruin his life. The narrative she presented was so divorced from reality that I initially struggled to formulate a response. The idea that someone would pack another person's valuables into boxes, including jewelry and financial documents, under the belief that those items were intended for donation was absurd on its face. The suggestion that I had misinterpreted what I had witnessed on multiple camera angles showing systematic theft occurring over a period of several hours required a level of willful blindness that I found genuinely shocking, even given my mother's long history of making excuses for Julian's behavior. I responded by asking her if she had seen the security footage that showed Julian and Vanessa going through my dresser drawers, removing jewelry from its storage boxes, examining financial documents, and packing everything into bags and containers that they had clearly brought with them for that specific purpose. My mother's response was immediate and defensive. She said that of course she had not seen any footage, that Julian would never agree to show her something that I had recorded without his knowledge or consent, because recording someone secretly was a violation of privacy that might not even be legal. She suggested that perhaps the footage did not actually show what I thought it showed, that maybe I needed to watch it again more carefully without the bias of already having decided that Julian was guilty. This response revealed something important about my mother's relationship to truth and reality. She was not evaluating evidence and reaching conclusions based on that evidence. She was starting with the conclusion that Julian could not be guilty of serious wrongdoing, and then working backward to construct a framework that would support that predetermined conclusion regardless of what the evidence actually demonstrated. This was not a new pattern. It was the same pattern that had been operating throughout my childhood and adult life, whenever Julian's behavior created problems. The difference now was that I was no longer willing to pretend that the pattern was reasonable, or that participating in it was a form of family loyalty rather than a form of family pathology. I told my mother that I would be happy to show her the footage if she genuinely wanted to see it, that I had saved multiple copies and could share them immediately. She responded by saying that she did not need to see the footage because she knew her son and she knew that whatever had happened, there was an explanation that did not involve criminal intent. She then shifted to a different argument, one that focused not on whether Julian had actually stolen from me, but on whether my response to that theft had been proportionate and appropriate. She asked me if I understood that Julian now had an arrest record that would appear on background checks, that this could cost him his current job and make it nearly impossible to find future employment, that I had potentially destroyed his entire future over what amounted to a family disagreement. She asked me if I had considered trying to talk to him first before calling the police, if I had thought about the possibility that there might be some explanation I was not aware of. She asked me if I realized that prosecuting my own brother would tear our family apart in ways that might never heal, that holidays and family gatherings would be forever awkward and painful, that I was forcing everyone to choose sides in a conflict that did not need to exist if I would simply drop the charges and handle this privately. The argument was sophisticated in its construction because it contained elements of truth that made it emotionally compelling, even though its underlying logic was fundamentally flawed. Yes, Julian's arrest would have negative consequences for his employment and future opportunities. Yes, prosecution would create lasting family rifts. Yes, holidays and gatherings would be permanently altered. But the suggestion that these consequences represented disproportionate punishment for his actions rather than natural and appropriate results of his choices was a reframing that required me to accept responsibility for outcomes that he had created through his own decisions. I responded by pointing out that Julian had made a choice to steal from me, knowing that theft was a crime with legal consequences. I said that I had not created his arrest record by reporting a crime. He had created his arrest record by committing a crime. I said that if our family relationships could not survive accountability for genuinely harmful behavior, then perhaps those relationships were not as valuable or healthy as we had been pretending they were. I said that I was not interested in handling this privately because private handling within our family had historically meant that I would be expected to absorb harm without complaint while Julian would face no meaningful consequences, and would therefore have no reason to change his behavior. My mother's response to these statements was to shift from rational argument to emotional appeal. Her voice broke as she told me that she could not believe I was choosing some material possessions over my own brother, that family was supposed to forgive and support each other through difficult times, that everyone makes mistakes and deserves grace rather than punishment. She said that my grandmother would be heartbroken if she knew that her jewelry had become the cause of family destruction, that what my grandmother had valued most was family unity and love, and that I was dishonoring her memory by using the inheritance she left me as a weapon against my brother. This particular argument was breathtaking in its manipulative sophistication. My mother was invoking my grandmother's values and memory to argue that I should not pursue justice for the theft of my grandmother's jewelry, effectively suggesting that my grandmother would have preferred that her carefully chosen gifts be stolen without consequence rather than that theft of those gifts create family conflict. The argument required completely ignoring what my grandmother had actually valued, which included personal responsibility, honest work, and treating other people with respect and integrity. My grandmother had been a deeply practical woman who had little patience for excuses or self-pity. I was quite certain that if she had been alive to witness Julian stealing jewelry she had specifically bequeathed to me, her response would have been immediate and unforgiving. But my mother was not actually interested in what my grandmother would have thought or wanted. She was using my grandmother's memory as a rhetorical tool to make me feel guilty for establishing boundaries and demanding accountability. This was a tactic I had seen her employ countless times in different contexts, invoking abstract values or absent authorities to avoid having to defend her arguments on their own merits. I told my mother that this conversation was not productive and that I needed to end the call. She responded by saying that she was not done talking, and that I owed it to her to hear her out after everything she had done for me throughout my life. I replied that I appreciated everything she had done for me, but that those past actions did not obligate me to accept mistreatment in the present or to protect someone who had violated my trust and safety. I said that I loved her and Julian both, but that love did not mean accepting harm, and that I hoped she would eventually be able to understand why I had made the choice I made even if she could not support it right now. She said that if I went through with pressing charges, I should not expect her to be at family gatherings where I was present, that she would not participate in the charade of pretending we were a happy family when I had destroyed that family by choosing vengeance over forgiveness. I told her that I was genuinely sorry she felt that way, but that her decision about family gatherings was hers to make, and that I would not allow her threat of withdrawal to manipulate me into dropping charges against someone who had committed serious crimes against me. The call ended shortly after that exchange, with neither of us saying goodbye, just a silence followed by the click of disconnection. I sat at my kitchen table after the call ended, feeling a complicated mixture of emotions that I struggled to untangle. There was grief over the recognition that my relationship with my mother was far more damaged than I had previously acknowledged, that her love for me was conditional in ways that her love for Julian apparently was not, that I had been participating in family dynamics that required me to continually sacrifice my own well-being to maintain an illusion of harmony. There was anger at the manipulation, at the suggestion that establishing boundaries and demanding accountability represented moral failure rather than necessary self-protection. There was relief at having finally stated clearly what I needed and wanted without hedging or apologizing or softening the message to make it more palatable. And underneath all of those emotions was a deeper exhaustion, the kind that comes from recognizing how much energy has been spent over many years maintaining a performance that was never sustainable and was never truly valued by the people for whom it was being performed. My father called 2 hours later. I almost did not answer this call either, but I was curious about whether his approach would differ from my mother's or whether they had coordinated their messaging in advance. His opening was more measured and less emotional than my mother's had been, which was consistent with his general interpersonal style. He began by acknowledging that what Julian had done was wrong, and that I had legitimate reasons to be upset. This acknowledgement felt like potential progress until he immediately followed it with qualifications that undermined the apparent concession. He said that while Julian's behavior was wrong, it was also true that I bore some responsibility for creating a situation where theft became possible, by failing to secure my valuables properly, and by leaving my bedroom accessible to guests in my home. He said that Julian was clearly going through a difficult period in his life, and that people in crisis sometimes make poor decisions that do not reflect their true character. He said that the appropriate family response to a member in crisis was support and accountability, rather than punishment through the criminal justice system, and that I had essentially outsourced a family problem to institutions that had no investment in rehabilitation or restoration. The argument was more intellectually coherent than my mother's emotional appeals, but it was no less fundamentally flawed in its core assumptions. The suggestion that I bore responsibility for the theft because I had not secured my home against family members who were staying there as invited guests was victim-blaming dressed up as practical wisdom. The characterization of Julian as being in crisis ignored the fact that Julian had been in some form of crisis for his entire adult life, and that the crises were often manufactured or exaggerated specifically to elicit sympathy and material support. The framing of criminal prosecution as incompatible with family support assumed that family support required protecting members from consequences, rather than allowing those consequences to function as necessary feedback about behavior that could not continue. I responded by asking my father if he genuinely believed that I should have anticipated that my brother would steal from me, and should therefore have locked my bedroom door and secured all valuables in a safe before allowing him to stay in my home. He replied that obviously I should not have needed to do that under ideal circumstances, but that given Julian's documented history of poor judgment and financial struggles, some additional precaution might have been prudent. I found this response remarkable because it simultaneously acknowledged that Julian had a documented history of poor judgment, while also suggesting that it was unreasonable of me to have reported behavior that was entirely consistent with that documented history. I asked my father what specifically he thought I should do differently at this point. Should I call the district attorney and ask them to drop the charges? Should I tell the police that I had made a mistake and that no theft had actually occurred? Should I simply accept that my grandmother's jewelry was gone, and that my financial documents were in someone else's possession, and pretend that none of this mattered because maintaining the appearance of family unity was more important than truth or justice or personal safety. My father responded that he was not telling me what to do, that I was an adult and needed to make my own decisions, but that he wanted me to carefully consider the long-term implications of the path I was choosing. He said that Julian would recover from this incident one way or another, either through the support of family members who helped him get his life back on track, or through the harsh education of the criminal justice system. He said that my relationship with my parents, however, might not recover if I proceeded with prosecution, because they could not in good conscience maintain close relationships with someone who had chosen legal punishment over family reconciliation when dealing with their son. This statement was interesting because it revealed the underlying transactional nature of my relationship with my parents. Their continued affection and involvement in my life was apparently contingent on my willingness to prioritize their emotional comfort over my own legitimate needs and boundaries. They were not threatening this contingency reluctantly as a tragic but unavoidable consequence of an impossible situation. They were stating it matter-of-factly as though it were a reasonable and natural position, as though unconditional parental love were something that needed to be earned through specific performances of loyalty, rather than something that existed as a foundation regardless of difficult circumstances. I told my father that I understood his position, and that I was genuinely sorry that my decision to report a crime was creating family conflict. I said that I hoped he and my mother would eventually be able to understand why I had made the choice I made, but that even if they never understood or accepted it, I could not prioritize their approval over my own safety and well-being. I said that I loved them both and that I hoped we would be able to maintain some kind of relationship going forward, but that I would not drop the charges against Julian, and that I would cooperate fully with whatever investigation or prosecution the district attorney chose to pursue. My father's response was a long silence followed by a statement that he needed to go, and that he would contact me if he had anything else to say. The call ended without any expression of affection or hope for future resolution. I sat with my phone in my hand, staring at the screen showing the ended call, feeling the weight of decisions that could not be undone and relationships that could not be unsaid. The remainder of that Friday was spent in practical activities that provided structure during hours that might otherwise have dissolved into overwhelming emotion. I contacted my bank to alert them that financial documents containing account information had been stolen, and to request enhanced security monitoring on all of my accounts. I contacted the credit bureaus to place fraud alerts on my credit reports. I changed passwords on every financial and personal account I maintained online. I filed a report with the Federal Trade Commission documenting the theft of identity documents. I contacted my insurance company to inquire about coverage for the stolen jewelry, and to initiate the claims process. Each of these tasks required explaining what had happened, which meant repeatedly articulating the sentence my brother stole from me to strangers who were professionally sympathetic but fundamentally disinterested in the emotional dimensions of the situation. There was something clarifying about this repetition. Each time I stated the facts plainly to someone who had no investment in protecting Julian or preserving family harmony, the reality of what had occurred became more concrete and less subject to the reframing efforts my parents were attempting. The insurance agent I spoke with asked whether I had filed a police report, and when I confirmed that I had, she said that the claim would be processed as theft rather than mysterious disappearance, which would significantly simplify the documentation requirements and approval process. She mentioned almost casually that theft claims involving family members were more common than most people realized, and that the company had specific procedures for handling such cases because they understood that these situations were emotionally complicated but legally straightforward. Her matter-of-fact tone was oddly comforting. This was not a unique situation that required extraordinary measures or moral deliberation. This was a category of incident that occurred frequently enough to have established protocols and standardized responses. By Friday evening I was exhausted in a way that transcended physical tiredness and extended into a deeper depletion of emotional and psychological resources. I had not eaten properly since the previous day. I had not slept more than 2 hours. I had been operating on adrenaline and determination and the momentum of practical tasks that needed completion. As I sat in my living room watching evening shadows lengthen across the floor, I felt the first genuine wave of grief break through the protective numbness I had been maintaining. I grieved for the relationship I had believed I had with my brother, the connection I had thought existed beneath the surface frustrations and disappointments. I grieved for the version of my family that I had been constructing in my imagination, the family that might someday evolve into healthier patterns if I just remained patient and supportive long enough. I grieved for the years I had spent performing loyalty and generosity and endless second chances without ever receiving reciprocal care or consideration. I grieved for my grandmother's jewelry, not because of its monetary value but because it represented a connection to someone who had loved me well, and that connection had been violated by someone who apparently valued me only for what he could extract from my willingness to help. I allowed myself to sit with this grief without trying to minimize it or rush through it. I understood that this was a necessary process, that acknowledging loss was the only path toward eventual healing, that pretending I was fine would only create problems that would manifest later in less manageable forms. I cried in my living room as the evening darkened into night, as my house settled into its familiar quiet sounds, as the security cameras I had installed continued recording empty rooms where nothing remarkable was happening, because the people who had violated my space were no longer present to create new violations. Saturday morning I woke early despite having finally fallen asleep sometime after midnight. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, beginning the process of drafting a comprehensive statement for the district attorney's office. The police report filed Thursday evening contained the basic facts of the incident, but I wanted to provide additional context that would help prosecutors understand the full scope of what had occurred, and why it represented serious criminal behavior, rather than a misunderstanding between family members. I wrote about the pattern of Julian's requests for help over the years, documenting the ways in which each instance of assistance had been followed not by improvement, but by additional crises that required additional intervention. I wrote about the specific warnings I had received from my own instincts during the 2 weeks Julian and Vanessa had been staying with me, the observations that had prompted me to install security cameras in the first place. I wrote about the calculated nature of the theft, the fact that it had occurred during a day when they knew I would be gone for an extended period, the systematic way they had searched my bedroom for items of maximum value, the inclusion of financial documents that suggested intentions extending beyond simple robbery. The process of writing this statement was clarifying in ways I had not anticipated. Seeing the pattern documented in chronological order made the progression obvious in a way that had been less apparent when experiencing it incrementally over many years. Each individual incident could be explained or minimized in isolation, but the accumulated evidence revealed a clear trajectory of escalating exploitation that had been enabled by my willingness to interpret harmful behavior charitably, and to prioritize family harmony over personal boundaries. I spent most of Saturday completing this statement, revising and refining until I was satisfied that it accurately represented both the facts of the immediate incident and the broader context that made those facts meaningful. By the time I finished, the document was 12 pages long, single-spaced, with timestamps and specific examples and references to the security footage that corroborated each claim. I saved multiple copies and prepared it for transmission to the district attorney's office on Monday morning. Sunday I forced myself to leave the house for the first time since Thursday evening. I went to a coffee shop in a neighborhood where I was unlikely to encounter anyone from my family or social circle, and I sat with a book I did not read while people around me engaged in ordinary weekend activities that felt surreal in their normalcy. The world had continued functioning while my personal world had been dismantled and rebuilt on different foundations. People were laughing over brunch plans and discussing movie recommendations, and making plans for upcoming holidays. Their lives contained no awareness of the rupture I had experienced, no accommodation for the fact that I was fundamentally changed from who I had been a week earlier. This disconnection from normal social rhythms was disorienting but also strangely liberating. I did not have to perform normalcy or pretend that everything was fine. I could simply sit in public space, surrounded by strangers who had no expectations of me, and exist without having to manage anyone else's emotions or protect anyone else from uncomfortable truths. For someone who had spent most of her life calibrating her behavior to accommodate other people's needs and feelings, this absence of social performance requirements felt like a radical form of freedom. I stayed at the coffee shop for 3 hours, long enough that the staff probably wondered if I intended to pay rent, and then I walked through the surrounding neighborhood without any particular destination or purpose. The physical movement helped settle some of the restless energy that had been building throughout the weekend, the sense that I should be doing something productive even though there was nothing productive left to do until business hours resumed Monday morning. As I walked, I thought about the different ways this situation could have unfolded if I had made different choices at various points in the progression. If I had refused to let Julian stay with me in the first place, the theft would never have occurred, but I would not have learned definitively that my brother was willing to steal from me given opportunity and perceived impunity. If I had not installed security cameras, I would not have evidence of the theft, and any confrontation would have dissolved into unprovable accusations that my family would have pressured me to drop in the interest of maintaining peace. If I had confronted Julian directly rather than calling police, he would have constructed some explanation that was superficially plausible, and I would have faced intense family pressure to accept that explanation and move forward without consequences. Each of those alternative paths would have resulted in less immediate conflict, but would also have perpetuated the underlying dynamics that had made the theft possible in the first place. The choice I had made, to document what occurred and to pursue legal accountability, was the only path that actually addressed the root problems rather than managing their symptoms. It was also the only path that required me to withstand significant relational consequences, and to accept that protecting myself might mean permanently altering family relationships that I had previously considered foundational to my identity and sense of belonging. By the time I returned home Sunday evening, I felt a tentative sense of clarity about the path forward. I would cooperate fully with whatever prosecution the district attorney chose to pursue. I would not attempt to reconcile with family members who required me to minimize harm or accept responsibility for someone else's criminal behavior as a condition of maintaining relationships. I would focus on rebuilding a sense of security and peace in my own home, which might require additional security measures or changes to routines or simply time for the violation to fade from immediate awareness into memory. Most importantly, I would stop performing the role of endlessly patient and forgiving older sister who absorbed chaos without complaint. That role had never protected me or served my interests. It had only enabled destructive patterns to continue unchallenged, while teaching the people around me that mistreating me carried no meaningful consequences. Learning to establish and maintain boundaries after nearly 3 decades of boundaryless family dynamics would be difficult work requiring sustained effort and tolerance for discomfort. But it was work that could no longer be deferred if I wanted to build a life based on authentic relationships rather than performative loyalty. The security cameras that had captured my brother's theft would remain installed indefinitely. They were no longer surveillance equipment monitoring potential threats. They had become a permanent reminder that trust must be earned through consistent behavior rather than assumed through biological connection, and that protecting myself was not a failure of love but rather a necessary precondition for any healthy form of love to exist. Monday morning arrived with the peculiar clarity that sometimes follows periods of intense emotional upheaval. I woke at 5:30, earlier than my alarm, and lay in bed watching the room gradually lighten as dawn approached. The guest bedroom where Julian and Vanessa had stayed remained exactly as the police had left it after collecting evidence on Thursday evening. I had not entered that room since their arrest, treating it as a contaminated space that I was not yet ready to reclaim and restore to its intended purpose. The closed door represented a boundary between the life I had been living and the life I was now beginning to construct, and I was not yet prepared to erase that boundary through the mundane act of cleaning and reorganizing. I arrived at my office by 7, nearly 2 hours before my first scheduled meeting, and used the quiet time to review the comprehensive statement I had prepared over the weekend. Reading through it with fresh perspective after a night of relatively uninterrupted sleep, I was struck by how clearly the pattern emerged when documented chronologically with specific examples and dates. What had felt during the actual experience like a series of disconnected incidents requiring individual responses now revealed itself as a coherent narrative of systematic exploitation that had escalated over years precisely because it had never been interrupted by meaningful consequences. At 8:45 I called the district attorney's office and asked to speak with whoever would be handling the case involving Julian Morrison and Vanessa Chun. After being transferred twice, I reached an assistant district attorney named Catherine Reeves who introduced herself as the prosecutor assigned to review the evidence and determine what charges would be filed. Her voice was professional and efficient, conveying neither sympathy nor judgment, simply a commitment to understanding the facts and applying appropriate legal standards. I asked if she had received the police report from Thursday evening, and she confirmed that it had been forwarded to her office Friday morning along with the security camera footage and the inventory of stolen items. She said she had reviewed the materials over the weekend, and had several follow-up questions that would help her assess the strength of the case and the appropriate severity of charges. I told her I had prepared a detailed written statement providing additional context, and that I could email it to her immediately if she found that helpful. She provided her email address and asked me to send the document before our phone conversation continued, so that she could reference it while we spoke. I sent the statement and waited while she reviewed it, listening to the sound of keyboard typing and occasional small noises that suggested she was making notes or highlighting sections. After approximately 10 minutes, she returned her attention to our call and said that the statement was extremely thorough and would be valuable both for prosecution purposes and for providing context that would help a judge understand why this case warranted serious treatment despite involving family members. She explained that based on the evidence currently available, she was confident that charges of felony theft could be filed against both Julian and Vanessa. The total value of stolen items exceeded the threshold for felony classification under state law, and the security footage provided clear documentation of intentional taking rather than misunderstanding or borrowing. The inclusion of financial documents and identity materials in the theft also supported potential additional charges related to identity theft preparation, though she would need to consult with specialists in financial crimes to determine whether the evidence met the specific statutory requirements for those charges. Catherine asked whether I had any reason to believe that Julian or Vanessa had already used the stolen financial information to open accounts or make purchases in my name. I explained the protective measures I had taken Friday, including fraud alerts with credit bureaus and enhanced monitoring through my bank, and confirmed that as of Sunday evening no suspicious activity had been detected. She said this was good news from a practical perspective but noted that the absence of completed fraud did not necessarily preclude charges related to the theft of documents that could facilitate such fraud, particularly given that relatively little time had passed between the theft and the arrest. She then asked a question that I had been anticipating but was still difficult to answer honestly. She wanted to know whether I was committed to seeing this prosecution through to whatever conclusion the legal process determined, or whether there was any possibility that I might change my mind and request that charges be dropped. She explained that her office needed to allocate resources carefully, and that prosecuting family dispute cases sometimes became complicated when victims experienced pressure from other family members to withdraw cooperation or minimize the severity of what had occurred. I told her that I understood her concern, and that I could assure her I was fully committed to cooperating with prosecution regardless of family pressure. I explained briefly the dynamics that had led to this incident, the pattern of enabling behavior that I was now deliberately choosing to interrupt, and the conversations I had already had with my parents that made clear they would not support my decision but would also not be able to manipulate me into reversing it. I said that I understood prosecution might take months and might require me to testify in court if the case went to trial, and that I was prepared to fulfill whatever obligations that process entailed. Catherine's response suggested that my explicit commitment had addressed a significant concern on her end. She said that family theft cases often resulted in drop charges or witness cooperation problems that undermined prosecution, and that my clear statement of intent made this case much more viable from her office's perspective. She explained the likely timeline for the next steps. Julian and Vanessa had been arraigned over the weekend and released on bail with conditions that included staying away from me and my property. Within the next 2 weeks, formal charges would be filed, and they would be required to appear for a preliminary hearing, where a judge would determine whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial. She mentioned that once formal charges were filed, there would likely be attempts by defense attorneys to negotiate a plea agreement that would avoid trial. She asked what outcome I was hoping to achieve through this prosecution, whether I was primarily interested in recovering the stolen property, in ensuring that Julian and Vanessa face criminal records and potential jail time, or in some combination of accountability measures that would address both the material and relational dimensions of what had occurred. This question required me to articulate something I had not yet fully formulated for myself. What did I actually want to happen as a result of this prosecution? My immediate emotional response was a desire for Julian to understand the severity of what he had done, to experience genuine remorse rather than self-pity, to recognize that his actions had consequences that extended beyond inconvenience to him personally. But I also understood that the criminal justice system was not particularly well designed to produce personal transformation or emotional reconciliation. Its primary functions involved punishment, deterrence, and public documentation of wrongdoing. I told Catherine that I wanted several things. I wanted the stolen property returned if possible, particularly my grandmother's jewelry, which held irreplaceable sentimental value. I wanted formal acknowledgement through the legal system that what had occurred was theft rather than a family misunderstanding, because that formal acknowledgement would prevent ongoing attempts by my family to reframe reality. I wanted whatever penalties were appropriate given the severity of the crime, both to hold Julian accountable and to establish clearly that family relationships did not provide immunity from consequences for harmful behavior. And I wanted protection from future contact or retaliation in the form of enforceable legal orders that would give me recourse if Julian or Vanessa attempted to approach me or my property again. Catherine said that all of those objectives were achievable through the prosecution process. The stolen items that had been recovered during the arrest would be held as evidence until the case concluded, and would then be returned to me. The formal conviction that would result from either a guilty plea or a trial verdict would create a permanent legal record that could not be disputed or reframed. The sentencing phase would involve input from both the prosecutor's office and from me as the victim, and we could advocate for penalties that reflected the breach of familial trust as an aggravating factor. And the protection orders I was seeking could be issued as conditions of bail immediately and made permanent as part of any final judgment. She concluded our conversation by saying that she would file formal charges by the end of the week and would keep me informed of all significant developments in the case. She provided her direct phone number and email address and told me to contact her immediately if I experienced any threats, harassment, or attempts at intimidation from Julian, Vanessa, or anyone acting on their behalf. She also mentioned that she would likely need to interview me in person at some point to prepare for potential trial testimony, but that we could schedule that conversation once the case timeline became clearer after the preliminary hearing. After ending the call with Catherine Reeves, I sat in my office feeling a complicated mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that the legal system was taking the case seriously, and that I would have professional support in pursuing accountability. Apprehension about the months ahead, and the ways in which this prosecution would continue to reverberate through every aspect of my family relationships and personal sense of identity. I was choosing a path that felt necessary and right, but it was not an easy path, and the difficulty was only beginning to fully manifest. My work that day was interrupted repeatedly by phone calls and text messages from family members and mutual acquaintances who had learned about Julian's arrest and wanted either to express opinions about my decision to press charges or to gather information they could share with others. My Aunt Margaret, my mother's sister, called mid-morning to tell me that she was deeply disappointed in my choice to involve the legal system in a family matter, and that she thought I was being vindictive and cruel. She said that Julian had always struggled, and that people who truly loved their family members found ways to help them through struggles, rather than punishing them for mistakes made during vulnerable periods. I asked my aunt if she would characterize stealing $18,000 worth of property as a mistake made during a vulnerable period, or as a deliberate crime planned and executed, when the perpetrator had been given access to the victim's home through trust and generosity. She responded that I was being legalistic and missing the larger point about family loyalty and forgiveness. I told her that I appreciated her perspective but that I disagreed with her characterization of loyalty as requiring tolerance for criminal behavior, and that I would not be discussing my decision further with people who had already determined that I was wrong without having full information about what had actually occurred. The conversation ended awkwardly, and I knew that my aunt would report back to my mother that I was being stubborn and unreasonable, and unwilling to listen to counsel from people who cared about me. This prediction was confirmed 2 hours later when my mother sent a long text message expressing her hurt that I was shutting out family members who were only trying to help me see the situation more clearly. The message concluded with a statement that she and my father had decided they would not be attending the family Thanksgiving gathering in 6 weeks if I was planning to be there, because they could not pretend that everything was normal when I had chosen to destroy their son's life over material possessions. This announcement about Thanksgiving was clearly intended to function as both punishment and leverage. By positioning their absence as a direct consequence of my decision to prosecute Julian, my mother was attempting to make me responsible for family disruption and holiday ruination. The implicit message was that I could prevent this outcome by dropping the charges, that family harmony was available to me if I simply prioritized it over my stubborn insistence on accountability. What she did not understand or refuse to acknowledge was that family harmony purchased through my acceptance of abuse and exploitation was not actually harmony, but rather a temporary suppression of conflict that would inevitably resurface in other forms. I responded to my mother's text with a brief message saying that I was sorry she felt unable to attend Thanksgiving, but that I understood her decision and would not try to change her mind. I did not argue with her characterization of my choices or attempt to defend my reasoning, because I had learned through our previous conversations that such arguments were futile. She was not evaluating evidence and reaching conclusions. She was protecting her preferred narrative and filtering out information that contradicted that narrative. No amount of explanation would change this fundamental dynamic. The following days established a pattern that would persist throughout the weeks leading up to Julian's preliminary hearing. I would go to work and attempt to focus on my professional responsibilities, managing construction projects and client relationships and team coordination. These activities provided structure and purpose, and reminded me that I had built a life with meaning and value independent of my family relationships. But the work was repeatedly interrupted by contact from family members or acquaintances who felt entitled to weigh in on my decision, usually without having asked questions or sought information about what had actually happened. Some of these contacts were hostile, explicitly criticizing my choice to involve law enforcement and suggesting that I was damaging my brother's future out of spite or excessive sensitivity. Others were superficially supportive, but contained implicit suggestions that I should consider whether prosecution was really necessary, or whether there might be other ways to address the situation that would be less destructive to family relationships. Very few people simply accepted that I had made a difficult decision based on legitimate concerns, and that I did not need or want their input about whether that decision was correct. I began screening my calls and letting most messages go to voicemail so that I could review them and decide whether response was necessary or productive. This screening process itself was exhausting, because it required constant evaluation of social obligations and relationship preservation considerations. Which calls could I ignore without creating additional conflict? Which messages required some form of response to prevent escalation? How much emotional energy could I afford to spend managing other people's reactions to a situation they did not fully understand and were not directly experiencing? My sister Nina called me on Wednesday evening, nearly a week after Julian's arrest. This was notable because Nina rarely initiated contact with family members and generally maintained her policy of strategic distance from family drama. Her voice when I answered was careful and measured, suggesting she had thought carefully about how to approach this conversation. She began by asking if I was okay and whether I needed anything, which was refreshing after days of calls that had focused entirely on what I owed to Julian or to family unity. I told her honestly that I was managing, but that the situation was more difficult than I had anticipated. Not because of regrets about reporting the theft, but because of the relentless social pressure from family members who insisted that I should have handled things differently. Nina responded that she had received multiple calls from our mother and Aunt Margaret over the past few days, and that she wanted me to know that she disagreed completely with their characterization of what I had done. She said that from what she understood of the situation, I had made the only reasonable choice available, and that she was proud of me for establishing boundaries that she knew were difficult to maintain given our family's historical patterns. This validation from Nina meant more than she probably realized. She was the only family member who had consistently demonstrated an ability to assess situations objectively rather than filtering everything through emotional loyalties or defensive protectiveness. Her support did not change the material circumstances I was navigating, but it provided confirmation that I was not delusional or unreasonable in my perception that the family's response to Julian's crime was more problematic than the crime itself. Nina also shared information that helped me understand some of the dynamics operating beneath the surface of my parents' reaction. She said that our mother had told her in confidence that Julian's legal situation had prompted her and our father to take out a loan to pay for his attorney fees, because Julian did not have savings or available credit to pay for legal representation himself. This loan was creating financial stress for them, particularly given that our father was only a few years away from planned retirement, and they had been hoping to focus on building retirement savings rather than taking on new debt. Understanding this financial dimension clarified some of my mother's anger and insistence that I drop the charges. It was not simply about protecting Julian from consequences or maintaining family harmony in abstract terms. It was also about protecting herself and my father from the concrete financial burden that Julian's legal defense was creating. By framing me as the person causing this financial stress through my decision to prosecute, she could avoid confronting the reality that Julian had caused the stress through his decision to commit theft. The displacement of blame was serving both emotional and practical functions, allowing her to maintain her view of Julian as victim while also justifying her resentment toward me for not preventing the situation she was now experiencing. Nina warned me that our parents' financial stress was likely to increase their pressure on me to drop charges, and that I should prepare for increasingly desperate attempts at manipulation or guilt inducement as the case progressed. She also mentioned that our mother had been telling extended family members that I was preventing her from helping Julian properly by insisting on prosecution, that if I would just drop the charges then Julian could focus on rebuilding his life instead of fighting criminal accusations. This narrative was factually absurd, given that dropping charges would not change the fact that Julian had committed theft or address any of the underlying patterns that had made the theft likely. But it was emotionally satisfying for our mother because it positioned her as trying to do the right thing while being thwarted by my unreasonableness. I thanked Nina for the information and for her support, and I asked her how she had managed to maintain such clear boundaries with our family when doing so often resulted in social penalties and accusations of disloyalty. She laughed quietly and said that she had simply decided years ago that she was not responsible for managing other people's emotions or protecting them from the consequences of their own choices, and that once she truly internalized that principle, most family drama became much easier to navigate. She said she still loved our parents and Julian, but that love did not require her to participate in dysfunctional dynamics or to sacrifice her own well-being to maintain relationships that were only sustainable if she consistently prioritized others' needs over her own. This philosophy sounded simple when articulated, but I knew from my own experience how difficult it was to implement, particularly for someone who had spent decades performing the role of responsible family member, who could be counted on to help during crises. Changing that role required not just a decision but sustained practice in tolerating other people's disappointment and anger without immediately moving to appease or repair. It required accepting that some relationships might be permanently damaged or lost, and trusting that relationships requiring constant self-sacrifice were not actually worth preserving in their current form. The preliminary hearing for Julian's case was scheduled for a Thursday morning 3 weeks after his arrest. Catherine Reeves contacted me the day before to let me know that I was not required to attend the hearing, but that I was welcome to be present if I wanted to observe the proceedings. She explained that preliminary hearings were typically brief and procedural, focused on whether sufficient evidence existed to proceed to trial rather than on determining guilt or innocence. Given the strength of the evidence in this case, including clear security footage and recovered stolen property, she anticipated that the judge would quickly find probable cause and schedule the case for trial. I decided to attend the hearing despite Catherine's assurance that my presence was optional. I wanted to observe the legal process firsthand, rather than receiving second-hand accounts that might be filtered through various people's biases and interpretations. I also wanted Julian to see me there, to understand that I was not hiding from this situation or allowing others to handle it on my behalf, that I was actively participating in holding him accountable. The courthouse was an imposing concrete structure built in the architectural style that seemed to characterize government buildings from the 1970s, all straight lines and minimal ornamentation, and a general atmosphere of bureaucratic authority. I arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled hearing time, and went through security screening that involved metal detectors and bag inspection. The hallway outside the courtroom where Julian's case would be heard was crowded with people waiting for various proceedings, some accompanied by attorneys in business attire, others sitting alone looking anxious or resigned. I saw my parents before they saw me. They were sitting on a bench near the courtroom entrance, my father reading something on his phone while my mother stared straight ahead with the tight expression she typically wore when experiencing significant stress. Julian was standing a few feet away talking with a man I assumed was his attorney, a middle-aged lawyer in a suit that had seen better days. Vanessa was present as well, standing slightly apart from Julian and looking bored or possibly dissociated. When my mother finally noticed me, her expression shifted from stressed to actively hostile. She said something to my father, who looked up and spotted me as well. For a moment I thought one of them might approach me, but they remained seated, perhaps because they understood that creating a scene in a courthouse hallway would not serve Julian's interests. Julian himself did not appear to have noticed my presence yet, as he was focused on whatever his attorney was explaining. Catherine Reeves arrived a few minutes later and greeted me with a professional nod before entering the courtroom to prepare for the hearing. I remained in the hallway, standing far enough from my parents that conversation was not possible but close enough that the physical tension was palpable. Other people waiting for hearings glanced occasionally at our small dysfunctional tableau, perhaps sensing the family drama without understanding its specific details. When the bailiff called Julian's case, we all filed into the courtroom and took seats in the gallery. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected based on television depictions, with seating for perhaps 30 people in the public area and a judge's bench that was elevated but not dramatically so. Julian and his attorney sat at the defense table, while Catherine Reeves positioned herself at the prosecution table. Vanessa had a separate attorney and sat at a different section of the defense table, maintaining physical distance from Julian, even though they were co-defendants in the same proceeding. The judge entered and the bailiff called for everyone to rise. The judge was a woman who appeared to be in her late 50s, with gray hair pulled back severely and reading glasses that she consulted frequently as she reviewed the case file. She addressed Julian and Vanessa directly, confirming their names and verifying that they understood the purpose of the preliminary hearing. Both responded affirmatively in voices that I could barely hear from my position in the gallery. Catherine Reeves presented the prosecution's evidence concisely and without dramatic flourish. She described the security camera footage showing Julian and Vanessa systematically searching my bedroom and removing property. She referenced the police report documenting the recovered stolen items and their estimated value. She noted that I had provided a detailed statement describing the relationship between myself and the defendants and explaining why their presence in my home had been based on trust, rather than any business arrangement or formal agreement that might complicate the characterization of their actions as theft. Julian's attorney attempted to argue that the evidence was ambiguous and that there were alternative explanations for what the security footage showed, but his arguments were half-hearted and unconvincing. The judge interrupted him midway through his second point to say that she had reviewed the video evidence herself and found it unambiguous in demonstrating intentional theft. She ruled that probable cause clearly existed, and that the case would proceed to trial unless resolved through plea agreement. She set a trial date approximately 3 months in the future and established various procedural deadlines for motions and discovery. The entire hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. As the judge concluded the proceedings and moved on to the next case on her docket, I felt a strange sense of anticlimax. I had built up this event in my mind as a significant moment, but the legal system treated it as routine administrative business requiring minimal time or attention. This was not a criticism of the system but rather a recognition that what felt like a life-defining crisis to me was simply one case among hundreds that the court processed each month. As we exited the courtroom, Julian finally made eye contact with me for the first time since his arrest. His expression contained no remorse or shame, only resentment and a kind of bewildered anger, as though he genuinely could not understand why I was doing this to him. We did not speak. There was nothing to say that had not already been communicated through the choice to prosecute and the choice to steal in the first place. I walked past him and his attorney and Vanessa and made my way out of the courthouse without looking back. My mother caught up with me in the parking lot, walking quickly to intercept me before I reached my car. Her face was flushed and her voice when she spoke was shaking with emotion that she was barely controlling. She asked me if I was satisfied now that I had seen my brother humiliated in court, if this was what I wanted, if I felt powerful forcing him through a legal process that would follow him for the rest of his life. I responded that I had not forced him through anything, that he had chosen to steal from me knowing that theft was a crime with legal consequences, and that what I had witnessed in the courtroom was not humiliation but accountability. She said that I had changed, that the daughter she raised would never have been this cold and unforgiving, that something had hardened in me that made me unrecognizable. I told her that she was correct, that I had changed, that I had finally learned to establish boundaries and to refuse to absorb harm for the sake of maintaining false peace, and that if this change made me unrecognizable then perhaps the person she thought she knew had been a performance that I could no longer sustain. She stared at me for a long moment and then walked away without another word, returning to where my father waited by their car. I sat in my own car for several minutes before starting the engine, processing what had just occurred, and what it meant for the relationships and identity structures I had relied upon for most of my life. I was choosing truth over comfort, boundaries over belonging, self-protection over social approval. These choices were necessary and right, but they were also costly in ways that extended far beyond the immediate legal proceedings. I was learning that standing up for yourself sometimes means standing alone, and that the people who claim to love you may actually love the version of you that serves their needs rather than the authentic person you are becoming when you stop performing for their benefit. The trial date was set for late January, which meant that the conflict would extend through the upcoming holiday season and into the new year. I would be navigating family gatherings and social obligations while this legal case remained unresolved, while my parents remained angry and unsupportive, while extended family members continued to pressure me to drop charges in the interest of family harmony. The path ahead was clear in terms of legal process, but deeply uncertain in terms of personal cost and relational consequences. What I knew with certainty was that I could not go back to the person I had been before installing those security cameras, before watching footage of my brother stealing from me, before making the choice to prioritize my own well-being over family loyalty that flowed only in one direction. The transformation was irreversible, and whatever emerged on the other side of this legal process would be built on foundations of truth and self-respect, rather than on the quicksand of enabling and false harmony that had characterized my family relationships for as long as I could remember. The weeks following the preliminary hearing established a rhythm of isolation that was both liberating and profoundly disorienting. I had spent nearly 3 decades existing within a family system that provided structure, identity, and social connection despite its numerous dysfunctions. Now I found myself operating outside that system, navigating holidays and personal milestones without the familiar anchors of family contact and approval. This isolation was a choice I had made consciously by refusing to drop the charges against Julian, but choosing isolation does not make it comfortable or easy to endure. Thanksgiving arrived with an emptiness that I had anticipated intellectually, but had not fully prepared for emotionally. In previous years, Thanksgiving had meant gathering at my parents' home with extended family, a chaotic event involving too much food and competing conversations, and the particular tensions that arise when people with complicated histories attempt to perform gratitude and harmony for several hours. I had often found these gatherings exhausting, and had sometimes fantasized about skipping them entirely. But the actual experience of spending Thanksgiving alone in my house, with no obligations and no expectations, revealed that I had derived more comfort from those gatherings than I had consciously recognized. I attempted to treat the day as simply another Thursday, working on household projects that I had been postponing, and preparing a modest meal that bore no resemblance to traditional Thanksgiving fare. But the silence in my house felt heavier than usual, weighted with awareness of conversations happening elsewhere that I was not part of, family stories being told that would not include my perspective, decisions being made about future gatherings that would not consider my availability or preferences. I was not mourning the loss of the actual Thanksgiving gathering, which had often been more obligation than pleasure. I was mourning the loss of belonging, the sense of being connected to something larger than my individual life, even when that connection was complicated and occasionally painful. My sister Nina called me that evening from the opposite coast where she was spending the holiday with friends rather than family. She asked how I was managing and whether I regretted my decision to prioritize honesty and accountability over family harmony. I told her that I did not regret the decision itself, but that I was struggling with the loneliness that resulted from that decision, with the recognition that relationships I had believed were foundational to my identity had actually been conditional on my willingness to absorb mistreatment without complaint. Nina said something during that conversation that shifted my perspective in a way that proved useful in the difficult months ahead. She said that loneliness and aloneness were not the same thing, that loneliness was the pain of feeling disconnected from others while aloneness was simply the state of being by yourself, and that it was possible to be alone without being lonely if you learned to find value and meaning in solitude, rather than viewing it primarily as the absence of company. She suggested that I might use this period of isolation not as something to endure until family relationships could be repaired, but as an opportunity to build a stronger relationship with myself, to discover what I actually valued and enjoyed when I was not constantly calibrating my choices based on other people's expectations and reactions. This reframing was helpful because it transformed isolation from a punishment I was suffering into a space I could actively inhabit and potentially benefit from. I began using my evenings and weekends differently, focusing on activities that I had neglected during years of managing family crises, and maintaining relationships that required constant effort. I returned to painting, a hobby I had enjoyed during college, but had abandoned after graduating, because it felt frivolous compared to the serious work of building a career and maintaining adult responsibilities. I discovered that I still found the process meditative and satisfying, that focusing on color and composition and technique provided a form of mental rest that was different from but equally valuable as sleep. I also began reading extensively about family systems and codependency, and the psychological patterns that develop in households where dysfunction is normalized, and where certain members are assigned roles that require them to absorb chaos created by others. This reading helped me understand that my experience was not unique or particularly unusual, that many people spent decades performing emotional labor to maintain family systems that did not serve their well-being, and that the decision to stop performing that labor often resulted in exactly the kind of social penalties and relationship ruptures I was experiencing. One book I encountered during this period described the concept of the identified patient in family systems theory, the idea that dysfunctional families often unconsciously designate one member as the problem in order to avoid confronting more systemic issues. Julian had been our family's identified patient for years, the person whose struggles justified everyone else's anxiety, and whose needs provided a shared project that allowed us to avoid examining the ways our family operated as a whole. By refusing to continue participating in the rescue and management of Julian's crises, I had disrupted this system in ways that forced everyone to confront questions they had been avoiding. My parents now had to consider whether their parenting approach had contributed to Julian's ongoing struggles. Extended family members had to examine whether their support of my parents' protective stance toward Julian had enabled rather than helped. And I had to recognize that my role as responsible older sister had not been primarily about helping Julian, but about maintaining a family equilibrium that prevented anyone from experiencing the discomfort of real change. This intellectual understanding did not eliminate the emotional difficulty of isolation, but it provided context that made the isolation more bearable. I was not being punished for making a wrong choice. I was experiencing the predictable consequences of interrupting a dysfunctional system, and those consequences said more about the system than about the validity of my decision to interrupt it. My professional life during this period provided both refuge and additional complications. Work had always been a space where I felt competent and valued, where effort translated into measurable results, where relationships operated according to relatively clear and rational principles. The construction projects I managed had problems that could be solved through analysis and planning, and the clients I worked with generally responded positively to competence and reliability. This stood in stark contrast to my family relationships, where competence and reliability had been taken for granted rather than appreciated, and where problems seemed to multiply regardless of how much effort I invested in addressing them. However, the stress of the ongoing legal case and family estrangement began affecting my work performance in ways I initially did not recognize. I found myself having difficulty concentrating during long meetings, losing track of conversations and needing to ask people to repeat information I should have absorbed the first time. I made small errors in budget calculations and timeline projections, nothing catastrophic but noticeable to colleagues who were accustomed to my usual precision. I became more irritable with team members, responding sharply to questions that I would normally have answered with patience, struggling to maintain the professional demeanor that had always come naturally to me. My supervisor, a senior partner named David Brennan who had mentored me since I joined the firm, requested a private meeting in early December to discuss what he described as concerns about my recent performance and demeanor. I entered his office with anxiety that I tried to mask as professional composure, unsure whether I was about to be reprimanded, offered support, or some combination of both. David began by acknowledging that I had been a consistently excellent employee for years, and that he was not questioning my overall competence or commitment. However, he said that several people had noticed changes in my behavior over the past month that suggested I might be dealing with significant personal stress. He mentioned the concentration lapses, the uncharacteristic errors, the moments of unprofessional irritability. He said that everyone experienced difficult periods, and that the firm valued its employees enough to want to provide support during those periods, rather than simply demanding uninterrupted performance, regardless of circumstances. He then asked directly whether there was something happening in my personal life that was affecting my ability to function optimally at work, and whether there were any accommodations or resources the firm could provide that might help me manage whatever I was dealing with. His tone was genuinely concerned rather than punitive, and I felt something release in my chest that I had not realized I was holding tightly. I made a decision in that moment to be honest about my situation rather than attempting to maintain the facade that everything was fine. I explained briefly that I was dealing with a family legal matter that had resulted in estrangement from my parents and significant social pressure from extended family members. I did not provide extensive details about the theft or the security cameras or the specific dynamics that had led to prosecution, but I conveyed enough information that David could understand why the situation was consuming emotional and mental resources that would normally be available for work. David listened without interrupting, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment before responding. He said that he appreciated my honesty, and that the firm had resources available through the Employee Assistance Program that included counseling services and legal consultation, if I needed additional support, beyond what I was already receiving. He also said that he wanted me to consider taking a brief leave of absence, perhaps 2 weeks over the holiday period, to focus on my personal situation without the added pressure of work responsibilities. This suggestion initially felt like a failure, an acknowledgement that I could not handle my personal and professional obligations simultaneously. But David framed it differently. He said that taking time to address a crisis was not weakness but rather strategic resource management, that attempting to maintain full professional productivity while navigating significant personal trauma was likely to result in either inadequate resolution of the personal situation or declining work performance or both. He said that he would rather have me take 2 weeks now to stabilize my situation than continue struggling for months while both my personal well-being and professional contributions deteriorated incrementally. I recognized the wisdom in this argument even though accepting it required setting aside the belief that I should be able to handle everything without needing help or accommodation. I agreed to take a 2-week leave starting the following Monday, which would extend through the Christmas and New Year holidays, and give me nearly 3 weeks away from work to focus exclusively on preparing for the trial and managing the emotional dimensions of family estrangement. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.